What's up, ladies? Today we are going to go over carbohydrates. I am Coach Shawna, and I am leading you through this specific presentation because I am carb obsessed. I am obsessed with getting my athletes to eat carbohydrates, and I have found that when I get them eating a sufficient amount, it literally changes everything. So we're going to first start with what is a carbohydrate. So carbohydrates are foods that contain starch, cellulose, and energy. They're broken down into the body to provide energy, and they also help support a healthy digestive system. When we talk about carbohydrates, we are talking about fruit, vegetables, oatmeal, rice, bananas. Wait, banana's a fruit. Bread, pasta, donuts, cake, sugar. So the sugar in milk is a carbohydrate. And we are talking about this broad group of foods. So vegetables are carbohydrates, but they don't have a ton of them in them. Whereas something like bread or a pasta is all carbohydrates and it has a lot of carbs in them. So carbohydrate is a carbon, oxygen, hydrogen molecule, and it has a whole bunch of other stuff in it that's in our foods, and then our foods are referred to as carbohydrates. Hopefully that's not excessively confusing. Why are carbs beneficial? Carbs are amazing for all kinds of things. So they give us energy for life and they give us energy for training, especially in our sport. CrossFit is referred to as a carbohydrate-dependent sport. What that means is when you go to start lifting your weights or running your 200 meters or doing your pull-ups, your body's preferred energy source to help you be able to do those pull-ups, it wants to use mostly carbs to fuel yourself. So you have three energy pathways. The two that we'll talk about real quick are your carbohydrate pathway and your fat pathway. So you've heard of maybe the fat burning zone. So your fat burning zone is when you move your body with an elevated heart rate, let's say walking to a slow run, over 30 minutes. Your body is going to use primarily fat as fuel. When we're in the 4 to 6 second range of activity up to 30 to 45 minutes, your body primarily uses carbohydrates as fuel. When we are talking about weight loss and we're talking about depleting our body of carbohydrates to force that body to use carbs, we're putting ourselves in a situation where if your body doesn't have carbohydrates immediately available, it still needs glucose, which is our body's ultimate form of energy, and it makes glucose from either carbohydrates or it will make it from protein and fat. So when we're in a situation, if we don't give our bodies enough carbohydrates, it's still going to make glucose, so it will use fat and protein as fuel, and it will use fat in other situations where it might prefer to use carbohydrates, which that means when you're going to do Fran and you need glucose because you can't get away from that energy pathway, your body is going to have to go, hang on a second, let me make some glucose from fat or let me make some glucose from protein, versus having those carbohydrates readily available, which is sometimes why you might notice that you don't have the energy to put into your training because you're in a carbohydrate depleted state. So that segues nicely into the impacts of not getting enough carbohydrates for sleep. So our brain likes to use carbohydrates for sleep. And if we don't give our brain enough carbohydrates, maybe like in the evening hours or even before bed, then we might find that we have light sleep or disrupted sleep. So I will often have my athletes have, and this is why I chose this slide, a banana before bed, because bananas have something in them that helps our brain make another molecule, which helps us sleep really well. So bananas have tryptophan, which our bodies use to make serotonin, which our bodies use to make melatonin. So giving our bodies enough carbohydrates before we go to bed helps our bodies facilitate nice deep sleep. And in regards to our menstrual cycle, so we have a lot of athletes who have irregular or lack a menstrual cycle altogether. And there's something called red reduced energy deficiency syndrome. So women who are not consuming enough overall calories, and especially if they're under eating and under fueling carbs, will find that they often have an irregular cycle or a complete lack of cycle. So what is happening there is your body thinks that it is in a famine state, right? And from an evolutionary standpoint, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for us to be making babies if food isn't around. So our bodies will slow down our specific hormone processes for being a female so that we can't make babies, so that we're not having babies when there's no food. But it doesn't know that there's actually 7-Eleven down the street and you could go get some carbohydrates, right? It doesn't know the difference between being in a famine state in a real world situation or we're choosing to be in a calorie/carb deficit. So consuming an adequate amount of carbs. And for adequate amount of carbs, I find most athletes need around a minimum of 200 grams of carbs a day, which I know might seem like a ton for you if you're used to under eating carbs regularly. And we'll talk about that throughout this week on how we're going to get you to increase your carb intake so that you're at a comfortable level. But consuming an adequate amount of carbs gives your body exactly what it needs to make all of the hormones to have a healthy menstrual cycle. And a healthy menstrual cycle is one of the best indicators that your body is happy and in a good place. So carbohydrates also support a healthy brain, a happy brain. You'll notice that, speaking of our hormones, you oftentimes will crave carbohydrates when you're in a stressed or PMS state, right? When you're anxious, depressed. So carbohydrates give our bodies what it needs to make dopamine and serotonin. And having a balanced level of carbohydrates daily allows your neurotransmitters, your serotonin and your dopamine, to pump along consistently and happily, versus the deprive yourself effect and then binge effect, where the binge effect is like you have given yourself nothing and your body is really unhappy, and then all of a sudden you overload it with a whole bunch of sugar and your brain's like, yay! And now you have this like almost drug addicted state to carbohydrates. So we try to get you to eat a balanced amount throughout the day so you don't have those highs and lows, and so that your brain just gets to be happy all the time. And speaking of, so when we don't deprive ourselves of carbohydrates, then we will prevent the cravings and the binging from happening. And we'll also learn to be comfortable honoring those cravings when they happen. When we are in the luteal phase of our menstrual cycle, which we'll have a whole week on hormones, but specifically when we're in the last 2 weeks of our hormone cycle, our high hormone phase, our bodies have a harder time accessing carbohydrates, and we actually need more calories. So if I have you eating a baseline of like 200 to 300 grams of carbohydrates a day, and then you get into your luteal phase because you're tracking now, because we're paying attention to that, and you notice all of a sudden your body is like, give me more, you're not scared to honor those cravings. First off, because we've gone through this presentation and we've talked about how carbs don't make you fat. And secondly, you know that if you're actually craving carbohydrates, you're not coming from a carb depleted state. So when you feed yourself those carbohydrates, you know your body genuinely needs them and deserves them, right? So you're not afraid of honoring those cravings. So baseline is extremely important because then you learn your system and you're comfortable giving your body what it needs. And lastly, carbohydrates support a healthy digestive tract. So you should be having 2 to 3 bowel movements a day. Those bowel movements should be balanced. They shouldn't be watery and they shouldn't be hard to pass. And you should be creating no more than like 6 to 8 farts, if you will, per day. So carbohydrates, specifically the higher fiber ones, give our digestive tract what it needs. You have this whole world called your microbiome in your guts, and feeding that microbiome with carbohydrates makes it super happy. It helps you have those nice solid bowel movements, and it also helps you produce serotonin, which your body in the gut uses for different things. So carbohydrates are really, really important, and we're going to teach you how to not be afraid of them. Which segues into this fun question. I can't tell you how many times I've had athletes refer to carbs as good or bad. There is no such thing as a good or bad carbohydrate. There is carbs that my body is going to use right now, and there are carbs that my body won't use right now. So we have something called the glycemic index. This refers to how quickly your body digests carbohydrates. Things like simple sugar, like the maple syrup on these pancakes, is going to be a high glycemic index food. Things like a sweet potato is going to be a low glycemic index food. What that means is if I eat a sweet potato, it's going to take my body potentially 1 to 2 hours to digest the potato and then create access to the carbohydrates in it. Versus if I were to eat something high glycemic like maple syrup, my body, you actually start digesting carbohydrates in your mouth. My body, as soon as I put that sugar in my mouth, it can already start breaking down that maple syrup and immediately access that sugar. So that's why, like, if you have a friend that's a diabetic, you always have something like candy available because they need fast sugar, right? Or like why we will tell you to have, a carb supplement, a liquid carb supplement in your drink that you have right before training or maybe during training, because you need to access those carbohydrates right away. The problem is that sedentary individuals will oftentimes consume high glycemic index carbs in a sedentary state, which means their body doesn't need those carbohydrates right away, and they'll store it as fat. So that's what happens. If you overconsume carbohydrates and you're not using them, your body's going to store them, which it's designed to do that. That's not a bad thing. It's a bad thing if you're someone who is extremely sedentary, not getting a ton of sleep, which raises your cortisol levels, and is, drinking 3 or 4 sodas a day, right? So now you've got a high glycemic index sugar combined with a sedentary individual who's not expending a ton of energy, and then they ultimately continue to gain weight. So there are no such thing as bad or good carbs. It's when am I going to use them, and do I need this one for what I'm about to do? Carbohydrate needs are based on gender, age, and based on gender, age, and activity level. So females actually tend to need more carbohydrates than men. I'm not going to go into deep detail on that now. Age, again, based off of your movement and your daily activity level, you're going to need more or less. So a younger individual is typically going to need more carbohydrates than an older individual. And your activity level, both your daily activity levels, what kind of job you do, and your training schedule. So if I have someone who is a firefighter and also a competitive CrossFitter, she's going to need 400 to 500 grams of carbs a day versus someone who maybe has a desk job and attends CrossFit class 4 or 5 times a week. She's going to need less carbs, okay? And then again, if I have a younger woman, an 18-year-old versus a 60-year-old, that 18-year-old is probably going to need more carbohydrates. Also depends on your lean muscle mass. The more lean muscle mass, the more carbohydrates you need, because more muscle requires more work for the body to maintain. And again, women need more carbs. Statistically, we do better with a higher carbohydrate diet. 30 to 50% of your carbohydrates, of your total calories should be coming from carbohydrates. And we're going to get into more detail with that this week. Does this all sound scary? And you have been told for however long that carbs make you fat, and now all of a sudden I'm saying no, they don't. I am going to show you over this next week how we're going to implement an awesome carb strategy to get you fueling your training, fueling your life, making you feel amazing, work on your hormones, manage the cravings. And with that, once you develop that confidence in yourself that you can feed your body what it needs, you're going to see that not only are carbs not the enemy, they might also be your best friend.